Today, a panel of experts from the U.S. National Science Foundation, academia, and industry are here to talk to you about what NSF is doing to address PFAS, as well as new technologies, knowledge, and partnerships we are turning to and enabling to help. While commonly known as PFAS, these chemicals are used in a variety of products we interact with daily. In fact, PFAS is so common that most people in the U.S. have been exposed to some PFAS chemicals. Research into PFAS, like the work we will discuss today, helps the U.S. and industries across borders understand PFAS detection and movement in the environment, as well as remediation and degradation options. You'll also hear about investments to design and deploy safer alternatives. Our panelists today are experts in a variety of disciplines related to PFAS research, solutions, and alternatives. We have Selma Thagard, who is a Richard and Helen March Professor of Chemical Engineering at Clarkson University and also the founder of DMAX Plasma Incorporated. Linda Molnar is a Program Director in the Convergence Accelerator under the Technology, Innovation, and Partnerships Directorate at National Science Foundation. We also have Anne-Marie Smoltner, who's the Program Director of Environmental Chemical Sciences Program under the Directorate for Mathematical and Physical Sciences at the U.S. National Science Foundation. Brooke Vermos is the Director of Environmental Energy and Chemical Management Programs within IBM's Chief Sustainability Office. And we have Carl Rockney, who's the Director of Environmental Engineering Program under the Engineering Directorate at U.S. National Science Foundation. So before we start, I'd like to talk about the format of today's briefing. I'll ask each panelist a short question so they can introduce themselves. After introductions, I'll pose a question to each panelist. They'll then answer the question and the rest of the panel will have an opportunity to weigh in. After the panel Q&A is complete, I'll open the briefing up for questions from the media. For the media question and answer session, please look at the bottom of your Zoom screen. You should see a Q&A icon. Please use that feature to enter your questions and I'll read them to the panelists. We ask you to wait to enter questions until after the panelist Q&A is complete. And with that, we'll go ahead and begin. So our first question is to Anne-Marie. You've had an extensive career in government. Can you tell us about your background and what has led you to your involvement with environmental chemistry?
Sorry. I'm Anne-Marie Schmaltner. I got a PhD in physical chemistry in University of California, and I was always interested in environmental issues. And after my postdoc in Germany, I came back to the US and I worked at a laboratory with the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, doing research on chemicals that are that have to do with the ozone hole issue. Actually, many of these chemicals also have lots of fluorine, so maybe early PFAS, so to speak. And then after that, I went to NASA and NASA headquarters in Washington, D.C., where I learned to be a program manager. And then I moved to the National Science Foundation, and I've been here for almost 30 years. Most of this time I spent in the Division of Atmospheric Sciences, and I've held various positions. And about 10 years ago, I moved to the Division of Chemistry. And here I lead the Environmental Chemical Sciences program.
Thank you so much. And Carl, you have an expansive background in engineering, working on topics like environmental biotechnology, environmental engineering, bioremediation, and more. Can you tell us about your background and how engineering plays a role in addressing the challenges we're seeing with PFAS today?
Absolutely. Thank you, Cassandra. So my background is it started out basically I was interested in the environment and trying to make a difference. And I did bop around a bit in college, but finally I discovered environmental engineering and found that was appealed to me because of its cross-disciplinary nature. It really is kind of applied chemistry and applied microbiology, and you add that together with physics to understand how the environment moves, how flows of water, for example, move. And that was my home. It took me a while. I did it a roundabout during my studies, but finally ended up in environmental engineering. And I got so interested in doing research that I ended up in academia. So I was a professor and still am with an appointment at University of Illinois at Chicago. And I also got interested in administration. So I did various academic administration positions. Throughout my career, I've focused on kind of understanding ways to solve environmental problems. So it hasn't always just been a focus on one problem, like, for example, PFAS, but also trying to understand other types of chemicals in the environment and their biological, chemical, and physical reactivity. So understanding that allows us to devise solutions to these environmental problems. A few years back, I threw my hat in the ring and became program director at the National Science Foundation through a program called IPA. I was here for 4 years, greatly enjoyed it. Then I went back to academia, and now I'm back as a program director, and very happy to be focused on solving this PFAS problem.
Thank you so much. And Selma, you have a unique background addressing PFAS as an entrepreneur, a researcher, and a professor. So can you tell us about your background and the work you've done related to PFAS?
Yeah, sure. So I'm a professor of chemical engineering and have been working on water treatment by plasmas for about 20 plus years now. And sometimes around 2014, a colleague and I had a project on developing a small water treatment system based on plasmas. And my colleague said, why don't we try to degrade some PFAS in your plasma reactor? And we had absolutely zero expectations because nothing essentially could degrade PFAS. And my colleague at the time was actually measuring the concentration of PFAS in fish in Great Lakes. So we had all the methodology ready to measure PFAS. And, lo and behold, PFAS was degraded faster than anything we ever tried. It was degraded within minutes in our plasma reactors. So we repeated the same experiments, 9, 10 times, always with the same results. And, this was kind of the birth origin of plasma-based PFAS treatment. And pretty much my entire research direction kind of went into the PFAS kind of area. And we got funding from, multi-years now from the NSF to that supports PFAS treatment, in particular Division of Physics, and the Plasma Physics program supports our PFAS work. And based actually off of that funding, we were able to commercialize this system to really large scale. And that was the origin and birth of our startup company, DMAX Plasma. And people, always think that plasma is something, very expensive. It's like a fusion or plasmas in the stars, but our process is actually really, really cheap. It uses as much as electricity as like a large kitchen appliance. So very good. We are happy to be working on such a huge environmental problem.
Thank you so much. Linda, your background is a bit different from other program directors at NSF. You actually came to NSF from industry. So can you share a little bit about yourself and how your unique experience fits into the overall strategy?
Absolutely. Thank you, Cassie, and good morning or good afternoon to everyone. I do bring significant industry experience as well as international experience throughout my career, and this is a little bit different from colleagues such as Carl, who I already mentioned. He's at NSF on an IPA, so he's sort of on loan from his home university and institution, and I've come here permanently from industry. I have experience launching other large federal government efforts. I was part of the Cancer Nanotechnology Program back in the mid-2000s. And so, similar to that, the PFAS challenge is really a global challenge that affects the entire semiconductor supply chain. And therefore, in order to bring solutions for this to the industry, we really requires collaboration across sectors, so public-private partnerships, and also international collaborations. So what we do in the Convergence Accelerator and also in the broader Technology Innovation and Partnerships Directorate is to really support these technical innovation ecosystems where we can bring faculty, students, and entrepreneurs to work on fundamental research areas that are relevant for industry. And so what's exciting about this is it provides us a context and a pathway to bring new fundamental innovations into the marketplace in a timely manner. So, thank you.
Thank you, Linda. And Brooke, we're very excited to have you join us from industry. Can you tell us a little more about yourself and your role within IBM?
Yeah, sure. Thank you so much. And thank you for having me on this panel today. I appreciate it. So I'm actually a board certified toxicologist, and I serve as a director within IBM's Chief Sustainability Office, where I lead a global team whose mission is to drive environmental excellence across all aspects of IBM's business. So my team is responsible for setting IBM's environmental policy and goals and objectives, and then driving execution and performance against those. And we're also really focused on how we can leverage hybrid cloud and emerging AI technologies to address some of these pressing environmental sustainability challenges that we have, like PFAS. And last year, I also had the privilege of chairing the SRC Microelectronics and Advanced Packaging Technologies Roadmap, their chapter on sustainability and energy efficiency. So not only am I focused on embedding sustainability across all that IBM does, but I also really want to build collaborative partnerships across the semiconductor industry to help decrease the overall environmental impact of microelectronics.
Thank you so much. Carl, can we start off with you telling us a little bit about PFAS and why we should care? Oh, you're still muted.
Sorry about that. So PFAS, which everybody hears about now. So these are per and polyfluorinated compounds, aliphatic compounds, and they have this unique feature where you have the fluorine atom being bound to the carbon atom. And that has actually some very good properties for a variety of different applications. Some of which, for example, that most people know about is things like Teflon, nonstick frying pans, and things like that. But there's actually a lot of other uses for these. There's aqueous film firefighting foams, which are used to put out fires, and a variety of other uses for them. So the stability of this fluorine-carbon bond, which gives it very good and important properties, makes it quite a bit of a challenge when there is releases of these compounds into the environment. Its stability means that it hangs around. And usually we think in the realm of, say, for example, environmental microbiology, microbes are amazing chemists, okay? They can pretty much eke out a living on almost anything. They have extremely rapid evolutionary kinetics, so they can adapt to and evolve the capability of breaking down a lot of compounds. But this fluorine-carbon bond is particularly challenging. And, we spent significant effort trying to understand whether these things can be metabolized in the environment and broken down. Sometimes you may have heard of the term the forever chemicals, and that's a way to kind of describe this extreme stability. And as we've learned from the environmental history of the last 100+ years, many compounds that end up in the environment are not broken down, come back and create problems for us. So what we look at with compounds like these is trying to get a better understanding of where they are, okay? So where they are in the environment, air, sea, sediment, soil, in people and organisms, etc. And what types of activities are they having? Even though these compounds are stable, they also can interact with various biological organisms and create to both humans and the environment. And so understanding those processes is kind of the first step to see if we have a problem. And then from there, we try to devise ways to mitigate these problems. One thing that is absolutely true is that it is very challenging to prevent any releases to the environment of almost anything. PFAS, as was discussed at the very beginning of this talk, globally distributed. They're semi-volatile, they can go through air, they can go through water, they can stick to sediment, etc. And so that's quite a challenge to deal with when these releases happen.
Thank you, Carl. And Linda, as we mentioned before, you're on the Convergence Accelerator team and you funded a lot of projects in this area. And so I'm wondering if you could share, why is the big focus on PFAS today?
Well, thank you for that question, because I always refer to PFAS as sort of the new old problem. They've been used for a long time in industry, but the increased awareness as of late is due really to the confluence of a few events. One is that both the US and the EU are working very hard now to build up manufacturing capacity of semiconductors in both areas. And semiconductors are absolutely critical for both economic development and national security. At the same time, as Carl mentioned, they have this moniker forever chemicals because they're both highly mobile and also persistent in the environment, right? And there's increasing scientific evidence that they are also detrimental, for both human and planet health. And so at the same time that all this is happening, one of the major producers of the various PFAS chemicals, 3M, made a decision that was made public in January of 2023 to phase out all their PFAS production by 2025. And so this has garnered an enormous response from the semiconductor industry as they understand the risk that this presents in producing these critical semiconductor materials, contribute significantly to economic development and our national competitiveness and national security. So, so that's why there's a lot of focus at this time.
Thank you. And Anne-Marie, can you share what you and your team in chemistry have done and are doing related to PFAS?
Yeah, thank you for that question. NSF has lots of programs, lots of divisions, and they often do similar things, but not necessarily the same thing. So Linda, for instance, represents a part of NSF that is interested in making collaboration with industry or doing things that are related to innovation, etc. Carl represents engineering, which is focused on solutions. And my division is, in my program in particular, environmental chemical sciences, looks at the fundamental chemistry of various things. And in this case, how things are related to the environment. So in terms of PFAS, we have projects that look at the fundamental properties of these chemicals. Their for instance, their absorption, their reactivity, both within the environment, but also in the maybe the engineered environment. We support laboratory work. We also support theoretical work, and part of the reason that is important is because there's so many of these PFAS compounds, thousands of them, and we can't study each of them individually, so we have to learn about sort of general properties and try to group them and class them and learn how to predict their reactivity and maybe their degradation processes. Also, what's very important is to be able to detect PFAS in the environment. They're there in very small concentrations, which is maybe why the world has ignored them for a long time. But if they are toxic, which is not something we study in my program, but there's obviously problems with them. So we need to be able to understand how much of them is out there. And again, the problem is there's so many different compounds. So we have a program that develops fundamental innovations in chemical measurements, and some of these projects are aimed at PFAS, both in a very highly sophisticated, special way to really look at identifying all these individual compounds, but maybe also developing cheap instrumentation that can detect plumes. You know, you can just take it to the river and see whether there's some emission or something like that. And then, of course, we have a lot of projects aimed at what could be done to remove or destroy PFAS. And for instance, there's techniques using catalysis, techniques to, for instance, with nanoparticles to capture PFAS, and then maybe once they've been captured to destroy them through photochemistry. And all of this is very, very fundamental in the way that we support it in the chemistry division, and maybe not necessarily ready for market. But I should also say that, you know, some of my projects are very similar to what Carl does. So Carl and I have to talk a lot and say, is this your program? Is this my program? So the lines between fundamental and applied are very, very fuzzy. And then, of course, PFAS are called the forever chemicals, but they do react with very reactive species in the environment, just not fast enough to get rid of them. But that's another area of research. And Carl mentioned bacteria, and of course, bacteria are the great hope here. Also, maybe we can train bacteria to destroy chemicals. And one of the projects that I recently funded looked at sort of the replacement compounds, the new PFAS compounds that might have chlorines instead of, you know, replace some of the fluorines with chlorine. So part of the effort is to look for new compounds that might be less harmful to the environment and to people and ecosystems, but that have the same or almost the same desirable properties, because we do need them for certain applications. And act in the environment and how they can be removed is also a topic that we should look at early on, because we don't want to replace one bad thing with another bad thing. We want to make sure we understand potential consequences ahead of time.
Thank you so much. Sorry about that. As has been mentioned, Carl, PFAS is very stable in the environment, which is part of what makes it difficult to remove. Can you tell us about new treatment technologies or methods to remove this chemical from the environment that NSF is enabling?
Absolutely. So, as I mentioned at the outset, describing my program, the overall goal or objective of the program is to prevent, mitigate, and remediate pollution, to prevent it, you know, from getting into the air, the environment, the soil, etc. And I use those words in the order of preference. Okay, the overall preference here is to prevent the problem from happening in the first place. So I think Linda will talk quite a bit about that as far as trying to prevent this problem. A lot of the research we've focused on in my program is trying to solve the problems that have happened. And so we're looking at things like mitigating impacts and also treatment technologies and remediation. So we started heavily investing in this space about in 2018, 2017. And we funded about almost 60 projects to the tune of nearly $20 million over that time frame. The various techniques and applications have looked at things like photolysis and photolytic degradation mechanisms using things like UV light, for example. We've also looked at physical trapments, ways to separate processes through everything from bubbles to absorption type processes to separate them out. One of the key things that you have to keep in mind that these are often present at very small concentrations, as Anne-Marie had said. And separating out things at low concentrations is a great challenge. It's a challenge because of fundamental thermodynamic limitations, and it also can be quite challenging to do this in a cost-effective manner. If we're dealing with very large volumes of water that need to be treated, for example, the costs can be quite high. And so that oftentimes goes into, we do study fundamental mechanistic reactions that are occurring, but we also have to understand that this insight will be ultimately, hopefully, lead towards treatment technologies that are efficient as well as economically feasible. Okay. So in addition to photolysis, we've looked at electrochemical applications. We've also done some work in plasma that Selma was talking about. We've spent considerable time supporting research to try to understand whether microbes can do anything. I would say the jury is still out. We've got some reports in the literature, some of which was funded by NSF. But so far, it's been quite a challenge for microbes to handle some of these compounds. One thing that I would emphasize is that a lot of the newer approaches that we've been supporting in the last few years have looked at things like single atom catalysis that have been very specific and very fast and rapid. So we're very excited about that. And the other point I would make is approaches that employ artificial intelligence and machine learning to see from this body of data that we've supported and produced from NSF supported research, trying to understand and build new types of adsorption molecules, for example, new types of membranes, new types of nanosorbents and treatment technologies that we can learn from the data. And instead of doing, kind of a lot of trial and error, which can be quite slow, but direct these approaches using what we've learned and AI techniques to get there at a much quicker and much more rapid pace.
Thank you so much, Carl. Selma, can you talk to us about why it's difficult to destroy PFAS and why electrical plasma is effective?
Okay, yeah, that's a great question and really challenging one. So we heard from Carl and earlier that the PFAS are characterized by this very strong carbon-fluorine bond, which is one of the strongest bonds in the nature. So current technologies that treat contaminants in water essentially are unable to break that carbon-fluorine bond. So plasma, you will allow me to briefly go into science in there, is a very interesting state of matter. It's really, really complicated. When you turn any kind of gas or water into plasma, you create this soup of different agents and radicals and species, right? A soup of different things that can actually degrade PFAS. So we don't know how plasmas actually degrade PFAS, to be honest, and we have currently funding from NSF to actually discover that. We strongly suspect it's actually a light generated by the plasma that plays a really big role in splitting that carbon-fluorine bond. So we actually, modify our plasma treatment system to bring PFAS very close to the plasma. And when we bring it there, we essentially just, apply plasma over that surface of the water, and that's how PFAS actually gets degraded. And some byproducts that we produce all of the byproducts are less toxic than the starting PFAS because you're essentially kind of just chopping off the fluorine atoms from that starting molecule, generating fluoride ions, which, at low enough concentrations are not toxic in water. And then ultimately, you just want to mineralize this compound and generate these fluoride ions. And that's what we do. And eventually, the fluoride ions can simply be removed from water by adding some lime or some salt that will precipitate it out, and essentially you would get PFAS-free water. That's kind of the general idea.
Thank you so much. Linda, so far we've talked about PFAS understanding, detection, remediation, but there's another major consideration for this PFAS challenge, and that is alternatives. Can you tell me about the work you've done with the Convergence Accelerator and why it's different?
Sure. So while from a scientific standpoint, finding alternatives for PFAS is an extremely difficult challenge. For all the reasons that were mentioned so far by Selma and Carl, it's also, very difficult to remove them from the environment. So what Selma's doing isn't either, right? So in some ways, there's a very pragmatic approach. It makes a lot of sense to, find environmentally sustainable alternatives for these materials in the first place. So getting at what Carl's saying, we really want to just prevent the environmental exposure and human health exposure. And so to do this, we need to draw upon fundamental research on detection and remediation from numerous scientific disciplines, the work that's discussed here and elsewhere, right? How do we have a mechanism to bring researchers together to solve this big complex problem? We need convergence research. We need to work across disciplines. We also need to work across sectors to solve these large problems. And so it's really critical to do this. And that is the mechanism that we provide in the Convergence Accelerator, that we bring all these key stakeholders together early on in the research process so we can avoid having, developing things like PFAS in the first place. And what we also want to make sure we do now is avoid regrettable substitutions, right? We don't want to end up replacing them with something that ultimately is worse. So we do need to fully understand the fate of existing PFAS. So I think they're really exciting times. I think that it's been incredibly interesting to bring together teams in the Convergence Accelerator that are working across all the different industry verticals that use PFAS. So not just semiconductors, but textiles, plastics, e-waste, built environment, right? All of these things contain PFAS. So looking across those different sectors and also getting the conversation going amongst scientists across disciplines. So just as one example, I have a fundamental material scientist that I have provided Convergence Accelerator funding to. And through his working with the other teams in the cohort, namely the IBM-led PFAS Knowledge Hub team, he got exposed to environmental chemists and the whole issue of PFAS, which he had never heard of before. And so now what he's doing with his research, and he published an open source paper on this, is really trying to prevent PFAS ever happening again, that type of issue, when he develops fundamental materials. So from the earliest stages of thinking about materials discovery to factor in environmental issues. And so and now also I would add that the semiconductor industry, many people feel, is really poised to lead in solving the PFAS problem because of the huge economic incentive right now, national security issues. We need semiconductors. So solving this for that industry can also have beneficial effects for other industries that use PFAS.
Thank you so much, Linda. And Brooke, how is IBM helping to accelerate the discovery of new materials, whether it be safer alternatives or new materials to help facilitate efficient and effective separation and filtration of PFAS to mitigate potential environmental release?
Yeah, thank you. It's a great question. So, we're a firm believer that knowledge is power, and information can be a convening force to help facilitate collaboration and partnerships and scale solutions. And PFAS, which is a PFAS replacement project funded by the NSF's Convergence Accelerator Initiative, is an effort that's being led by IBM Research. And it really is bringing together, thanks to Linda's support and help, it's bringing together a group of experts in academia, industry, and the nonprofit sector in a multi-pronged effort to reduce the environmental impacts of PFAS. And this project really has three main objectives. First, we want to help companies identify the use of PFAS chemicals and materials. There's not a single agreed upon definition of PFAS, and there's not a single agreed upon list of PFAS compounds, which makes it then really hard in identifying PFAS. So we want to help with that problem. And then second, we want to leverage generative AI capabilities and our own foundation models for material discovery to help accelerate the discovery of safer PFAS alternatives. And third, we also want to be able to help recommend methods for capturing PFAS from industrial applications until viable replacements can be found. But addressing the PFAS challenge requires unprecedented collaboration across diverse sectors, like Linda mentioned. Like no single company or no single industry can solve these complex issues alone. So we really must forge some very innovative partnerships to leverage unique skills and perspectives. And this collaborative approach, combining these varied expertise and fresh viewpoints is really critical for developing the most innovative and effective solutions. So as I mentioned, in addition to IBM Research, other collaborators include, Digital Science, which is a London-based tech company that's going to help us gather into a single database all PFAS that have been reported in the scientific literature, along with the regulatory classifications. We're working with Chem Forward, who's a nonprofit focused on safer chemistry adoption, and we're working with them to develop a user interface that will allow companies to screen chemicals and materials in their supply chain for PFAS. And then we're also working with the university side with Damien from Cornell, who's working to understand PFAS transformation products. We're working with Carla from the University of Pittsburgh, who's running simulation of how PFAS interact with proteins in the body. And this simulation data will help steer the generative AI models away from molecules with similar structures and potentially the same disruptive effects. And this is really important because some of the most sensitive endpoints associated with PFAS toxicity, are just not adequately captured with traditional toxicology models. So, we really need to use new approaches for assessing PFAS toxicity as well as PFAS alternatives. And then we're also working with NewMat Technologies, who specializes in developing materials for capturing fluorinated gases. So we're trying to take a very holistic approach to addressing this problem and really focusing on being able to provide users information so that they can make informed decisions and, just move forward with eyes wide open.
Great, thank you so much. At this time, I would like to invite media to go ahead and enter in their questions. Again, there should be a Q&A button on the bottom of your screen. You can go ahead, click that button and ask your question, and we'll ask the group the question. Starting off this Q&A portion, Brooke, I'd like to ask you, and then anybody else who would like to jump in, please feel free. We've heard semiconductor production mentioned numerous times throughout the presentation, and I was hoping you could explain why is PFAS critical for semiconductor production, and why has it been so hard to replace?
Yeah, sure. That's a great question. And truly from an environmental perspective, one of the greatest challenges facing the semiconductor industry today is the use of PFAS, which, as we've heard today, it's a chemical class representing thousands of different compounds that, as Linda mentioned, they're used pervasively throughout many industries, including semiconductor manufacturing and packaging operations. And the unique properties of PFAS make them essential for multiple semiconductor processes, like photolithography and process gases and chip packaging and more. So finding those safer alternatives that can still meet the same performance characteristics of PFAS will be extremely challenging, especially given the multiple properties that PFAS incorporate for any one given application. Also, semiconductor manufacturing involves intricate chemical interactions across thousands of different steps using numerous chemical formulations. So replacing a single chemical component requires extensive and multivariable evaluations by both chemical suppliers and device manufacturers to ensure that changes in any one particular step doesn't negatively impact the overall performance of the product. So addressing this challenge really requires, again, a very collaborative effort amongst a whole suite of players along the semiconductor ecosystem.
Thank you so much. Selma, can your work in PFAS be applied to other chemicals?
That's a very tricky question. I'm going to say in theory it could, but in reality, I don't know if it would work as well as for the PFAS. And that is because the entire system, the entire process, how we designed it, every single element actually is targeting a particular property of PFAS. So for example, we bubble a gas through the solution to capture PFAS from the liquid and bring them to the gas liquid interface. That might necessarily work for other contaminants. So the system is really, really targeted exclusively towards PFAS. So any compound that, for example, resembles a PFAS or has similar behavior, let's say, surfactants or detergents, or maybe paper mill company effluents or hospital effluents, something that foams, our system would work really well for those types of contaminants, but not for every water, just water.
Thank you. And I think this question might be for Carl, but others are free to jump in. Do water treatment plants remove PFAS from drinking water?
Yeah, so maybe a little bit of background on that question. So first of all, this is not quite so well known, but clean drinking water is actually the most important public health development of the 20th century. It led to about 2/3 of the increasing lifespan of Americans during that century. It's often not recognized how important having clean, potable, safe drinking water is. Now, the techniques and technologies that are used to treat very large volumes of water for, say, a city, think about it. Every person in the city consumes about 100 gallons every day. And so you multiply that out to a large city, you really have huge volumes of water that need to be treated. One of the characteristics of PFAS is that they have this molecular structure that makes them much more challenging to remove using the techniques and technologies that have been developed over essentially 100 years in the water treatment field. And so that makes it quite challenging. Many of the technologies are for compounds that have different behavior than the PFAS do. So keep that in mind. There are some existing techniques that do result in some removal. For example, when you think of granular activated carbon, that's one technology, but it's not perfect for PFAS because of this interesting nature of the molecular structure for these compounds. So right now with existing technologies, they don't really do a good job. That's why there's been this tremendous effort at the National Science Foundation and many other federal agencies to look at new technologies that can work to treat and clean drinking water. And I'd be, interested to hear from my colleagues as well on this.
Does anybody else want to jump in? All right. So we've talked a lot about the science, about PFAS, about what it is. And so I was wondering if anybody could share any workforce development efforts that are related to PFAS or related research.
Cassie, I can take a first stab at that if you want. That is actually a very large aspect of the Convergence Accelerator that we think about education, workforce development. So one of my semiconductor teams actually is paving this new way of looking at both technology development alongside the environment and alongside education, workforce development. So anytime you have a new emerging technology, you're thinking about the environment and education, workforce development in parallel with developing that technology. And so, one thing we hadn't touched upon, Cassie, was this concept of a circular economy, right? And so what pertains here to this discussion is that, I don't think a lot of people realize, but in 2020, the journal Nature published an article, and that's when scientists estimate that we now have more things, man-made things on Earth than living beings. And so that's actually not sustainable. And that has arisen from the fact that we have this very linear economy right now where we extract natural products from the earth, and then we make products, and we use them, and then they become waste. But we haven't dealt with that waste really until recently. And so this is something that we really think about in the Convergence Accelerator program in 2 tracks, one track on sustainable materials for global challenges, and then another track on equitable water solutions. And the idea being that we really need to think about circular design and circular economy. So anytime we develop a new material, a new product, we need to think not only about how we're manufacturing that material and the impact that that has, but also the lifetime impact of that product. So what happens to it when you're done using it? And so the more that we can transition from linearity to circularity, the more that we can get ahead of the fact that, that we're also have to deal with a lot of the waste, that's out there in the environment now from all industry verticals. But to catch up, to move forward, we really need to design, a different future.
Can I add some comments on workforce development? Education writ large is woven throughout NSF's activities. There are some programs that specifically are addressing education. For instance, the Graduate Research Fellowship Program, where individuals can get fellowships to do research. But pretty much every grant that we make to a university, small or big, supports graduate students, often undergraduate students, sometimes high school students, and they are very much engaged in the research and are being trained for a career in science and technology. We have postdoc programs, and for instance, MPS, my directorate, has a postdoc program called MPS Ascend, and it has a heavy broadening participation component. And one of the postdocs chose a topic that has to do with PFAS detection and fundamental properties. So PFAS as a topic shows up all over the place. It also shows up in, for instance, instrumentation awards, right? We develop instrumentation, as we mentioned earlier, for the detection of various compounds in the environment or in other media. And this instrumentation can be either developed or acquired, and so PFAS shows up there. We have research experience for undergraduate programs where undergraduate students get to do research in the summer with faculty members, usually not at their own institution. And we look at these awards, we do a search, and we found out that some of the projects in there address PFAS. So the education outreach and also public outreach. So for instance, to efforts within a project to communicate to the public about the importance of PFAS and other contaminants that is often a part of the projects that we award. And NSF has two fundamental review criteria, right? Intellectual merit and broader impacts. And the broader impact often is comprises educational and outreach activities that bring the importance of the work done to the public.
Cassie, I would just add a comment if now is an appropriate time. I just wanted to say, what exciting times there are at NSF now when we have this new Technology Innovation and Partnerships Directorate. So now even more than before, we're really coming up with innovative funding mechanisms and ways to interact with the research enterprise, to bring in industry expertise, nonprofit expertise, across all sectors and disciplines. And I get to interact with folks around the entire NSF from every discipline. And so I think it's very exciting because there are a lot of complex challenges in the world right now. And I think this is a great way to bring everybody in to solving, working together to solving those problems. And then that does serve the purpose of, we are essentially educating and training a new research enterprise that will look at problems and solve problems in a different way.
Thank you so much. And thank you to all of our panelists for joining us today. Thank you for media in attendance. We're going to go ahead and close out this session. Have a wonderful day. Bye, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye.